This family has to be cursed at this point, because one of the brothers survived being abducted at 7 years old and then held captive for another 7 years, until he somehow escaped with another 5-year-old kidnapping victim. And the man that kidnapped them, yeah, he only served 5 years in prison, and he was let out to continue trying to kidnap other young boys. But that's not all. The other brother in this family later went on to become a serial killer decades after his little brother was kidnapped. He ended up brutally killing 4 women in and around Yosemite National Park. So you have 2 totally different ends of the story when it comes to these brothers, yet they are both equally as horrible. This is the disturbing story of Steven Stainer, the little boy who survived a horrific kidnapping and captivity, and of his brother Cary Stainer, who later became a national park serial killer. I'm not gonna lie, the deeper the story goes, the more devastating and depressing it gets, so bear with me, but let's talk about it. This is Steven Stainer. He was only 7 years old when he disappeared from his hometown of Merced, California on December 4th, 1972. Steven lived with his 3 sisters, 1 older brother, and his mom and dad in a nice little neighborhood where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. They were a big family that by all accounts was just your typical loving family. But one winter night, everything would change. So that day when Steven was walking home from school, he was approached by a local man named Irvin Murphy. Unbeknownst to Steven, Irvin had been approaching multiple little boys walking home from school and handing them some religious pamphlets. On the surface, this was maybe a little weird, but in reality, Irvin had been hired to do something much more sinister. So Irvin had been getting pretty close to a man named Kenneth Parnell. Kenneth was a convicted child molester, but he worked with Irvin at a resort in Yosemite National Park. Kenneth was a really twisted man, and he had hired Irvin to abduct a little boy for him under the pretense that he was an aspiring minister, and that he wanted a little boy so they could raise him in a religious, cult-like environment. None of the little boys gave Irvin the time of day that afternoon, until he came across 7-year-old Steven. He told Steven that he was a church representative looking for donations, and he asked him if his mom would be willing to donate some items to the church. And since Steven and his mom were really nice and would often do things like that, he said yes and promised to show Irvin where he lived. As they started walking, Kenneth pulled up beside them in his car and offered to take them all back to Steven's house to gather the donation items. So Steven entered the car with Irvin, and when Kenneth started driving, he quickly realized he wasn't being taken home. Instead, Kenneth drove them to his cabin in Cathy's Valley, California, which is about 40 miles away from Steven's home. Once there, he began SAing Steven, where he then held him captive for the next 7 years. What Steven went through was unimaginable, but what's so incredibly heartbreaking is the fact that the cabin where he was being held captive was only a couple hundred feet from his grandpa's house, yet no one knew where he was. Steven begged Kenneth to let him go home, but Kenneth told him that he now had legal custody of him, and that his parents couldn't afford that many kids and therefore didn't want him anymore. So with no other option, Steven had to stay with him, where he underwent some pretty severe things. Kenneth eventually gave Steven a partially new name, so now he was known as Dennis Gregory Parnell. He kept his real middle name as Gregory and his real birth date, and he went on to enroll Steven in school and pretended to be his real dad to everyone. He let Steven smoke and drink, but what makes this case stand out is that Kenneth also let him come and go virtually whenever he pleased. He would also be gone a lot traveling for work, and during those times, Steven would be unattended. After he was rescued, Steven later said that he knew that he could leave during those moments, but he never knew how to actually get help, which is so sad. What's super weird though is that a lot of people knew about Steven, except for Kenneth's actual family, who had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. When Steven was 9 years old, and for a period of about 18 months after that, Kenneth let one of his girlfriends move in with them. Her name was Barbara Mathias, and together, she and Kenneth SA'd Steven multiple times. At one point, Barbara even tried to lure another young boy into Kenneth's car for him. It was a young boy who was also in the Santa Rosa Boys Club with Steven, yet this attempted kidnapping was unsuccessful. This relationship eventually ended, but Steven's abuse and captivity didn't. As he got older though, and went through puberty, Kenneth's attraction to him lessened. He then began plotting to kidnap another young boy, and he even used Steven to try and kidnap them for him. But knowing the horrible things that he himself was being put through, he didn't want another young boy to go through the same things. So whenever Kenneth forced him to try and kidnap someone else, he would always purposefully sabotage the plan, so he was never successful. This brings us to Valentine's Day 1980. This is when Kenneth, along with a teenage friend of Steven's named Randall, actually carried out and kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White. They kidnapped Timothy while he was playing outside in his front yard in Ukiah, California, and then they took him back to Kenneth's home. Once there, Kenneth presented Timothy as Steven's new little brother. Steven recalled seeing how scared Timothy was, and he knew right then and there that he never wanted another little boy to go through what he did, so he knew that he needed to do something about it. On March 1st, 1980, Steven waited for Kenneth to leave for his night security job, and once he was gone, he took Timothy by the hands, and together they escaped. They somehow hitchhiked all the way to Ukiah, Kaya, and keep in mind, Stephen was still a little boy at this point. He was only 14 years old himself, and he was brave enough to not only rescue himself, but to also save Timothy's life as well. They tried finding Timothy's house, but they eventually went to the police department. By the next morning, Kenneth was arrested under the suspicion of kidnapping both boys. After the police looked into his past, they found that he had a prior SA conviction dating all the way back to 1951, yet he never served any time for it. Both Stephen and Timothy were reunited with their families that day, and this was a huge shock for everyone because at this point, 7 years had passed since Stephen had been kidnapped. Nobody knew whether he was alive or not that entire time. When he vanished, he literally disappeared into thin air. What's so crazy is that Kenneth faced 2 trials, and he was convicted of kidnapping both boys, but he wasn't ever charged with the numerous sexual assaults on Stephen and other local boys because of 2 reasons. One being that it was outside the jurisdiction of the Merced County prosecutors, and the other reason was that those assaults were all outside the statute of limitations. So because of this, Kenneth was only sentenced to 7 years in prison, and he was released after only serving 5. That's insane to me. He spent less time in prison than Stephen did in captivity, which is not fair at all, and I don't get how this was allowed to happen. Irvin and Randall, the 2 people who helped with the abductions, were also convicted of lesser charges. Barbara, on the other hand, was never charged. She, as well as the other 2, tried claiming that they didn't know Stephen was kidnapped or was being SA'd, which is complete bull. But what's really sad is that once he was rescued, Stephen had a really hard time adjusting back to normal life. He later went on to say, quote, "I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? Everything has changed, and sometimes I blame myself. I don't know sometimes if I should have come home. Would I have been better off if I didn't?" End quote. It literally brings me to tears knowing that he thought any of that was his fault. And as a mom, my heart breaks thinking about him as a little kid, wondering why his dad never hugged him again after being rescued. Stephen tried therapy, but his dad ended up pulling him out, saying that he didn't need it. His siblings watched as he moved on with his life, but Stephen was never the same. They said he was pretty messed up and began drinking heavily. He was also really bullied in school for being a male victim of SA, to the point where he eventually dropped out. It's so sad that he had such a hard beginning of his life, and yet even after being rescued, it didn't get much easier. His dad eventually kicked him out of the family home, but this didn't stop Stephen from trying to live a good life. In 1985, he went on to get married and have 2 beautiful kids. Outside of working at a local pizza place in Merced, he spent a lot of his time working with child abduction groups and speaking with children about personal safety. By all means, he had really turned his life around and finally started to heal and find peace. But just a few years later, this would all be taken from him once again. On September 16th, 1989, Stephen, now 24 years old, was on its way home from work when a car abruptly turned in front of his motorcycle, hitting him head on. Stephen suffered head injuries that were really severe, and sadly, he did not survive this. The person who hit him quickly fled the scene, so it was a pretty brutal hit and run. He was eventually tracked down, but he only served 3 months in prison for a hit and run. He was somehow found not guilty of manslaughter, even though he literally killed Stephen and then left him there. As I was researching this case, I noticed a really depressing pattern of people continuously hurting Stephen, yet never being held accountable for it. Over 500 people attended Stephen's funeral, and one of the pallbearers was Timothy White, the 5-year-old that Stephen helped escape. At the time of the funeral, Timothy was 14 years old. Just a few months before Stephen died, a 2-part TV miniseries was created based on his case. It was called I Know My First Name is Stephen. He himself starred in it as one of the police officers who rescued him. Stephen said that overall he really liked the series, but he didn't like how it portrayed him as an obnoxious, rude kid to his parents, which he said he never was. He only ever wanted them to love him. I Know My First Name is Stephen was later released as a full feature-length movie, which earned 4 Emmy nominations. This was based on a manuscript by Mike Eccles, who interviewed not only Stephen before he died, but also Kenneth himself. A quick, interesting, but sad fact, the title for this film, I Know My First Name is Stephen, was inspired and taken from the first paragraph of Stephen's written police statement, which was given just hours after he was rescued in 1980. This was his statement. It says, quote, "My name is Stephen Stainer. I am 14 years of age. I don't know my true birth date, but I use April 18th, 1965. I know my first name is Stephen. I'm pretty sure my last name is Stainer. And if I have a middle name, I don't know it. And I wish I could say the story gets better, but it really, really doesn't." So in 2004, Kenneth, who was now 72 years old, was arrested for trying to get his caretaker sister to abduct a young boy for him. He offered her $500 to kidnap a little boy for him, which she declined and reported this to the police, knowing his past with Stephen. At the trial for this, Timothy White, the little boy that Stephen rescued, gave his testimony. At this point, Timothy was now a grown man. Authorities also used Stephen's old testimony against Kenneth, and with this, Kenneth was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He died just 4 years later from natural causes, so honestly, I feel like justice wasn't really served. Timothy later went on to become a deputy with the LA County Sheriff's Department, but sadly, in 2010, he died at just 35 years old from a pulmonary embolism. This was another devastating loss for the community, as he had survived something so horrific so young, only to die just years later from something else, just like Stephen. After his death, residents of Ukiah, which was Timothy's hometown and where he was abducted from, carved a statue in his and Stephen's honor. The statue shows Stephen at 14 years old holding a 5-year-old Timothy in his hands as they escape their captivity. This story was really devastating, but it really only gets worse for the Stainer family. Decades after Stephen was kidnapped, his older brother Carrie became a serial killer. In February of 1999, 42-year-old Carol Sund took her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Silvina Peloso, a 16-year-old exchange student from Argentina, on a trip to Yosemite. They checked into the Cedar Lodge and El Portal, and then they vanished. Weeks later, the rental car was discovered deep in the woods, burned to nothing. Inside the trunk were the charred remains of Carol and Silvina. Soon after, a letter arrived in the mail to authorities that read, quote, "We had fun with this one," end quote. Attached was a map with directions leading police to Julie's body, found miles away from the others. Detectives questioned several people from the lodge, including a quiet handyman named Carrie, aka Carrie Stainer, the brother of kidnapping victim Stephen Stainer. He wasn't initially considered a suspect, and soon the investigation went cold. Then, that July, a 26-year-old woman named Joey who loved visiting Yosemite was found decapitated near her cabin. Witnesses reported seeing a distinctive vehicle nearby, an old International Scout. It led investigators straight back to Carrie. When confronted, he confessed, but not just to Joey's murder. He also confessed to killing the 3 women who disappeared months earlier. He was sentenced to life without parole for Joey's killing, and later to death for the murders of Carol, Julie, and Silvina. Today, Carrie sits on death row where he still waits for the end he once gave to others. I think every true crime case is horrible, obviously, but this one just kept getting worse and worse. Nothing makes me more sad than knowing what Stephen went through, only to die at the hands of another person such a short time later. And I don't know if what happened to his little brother influenced Carrie's killer tendencies at all, but like I said at the beginning of this video, this family has to be cursed. I don't know, it's stories like this that really keep me up at night.